Good morning. I'm Rob Salem, and I'm a clinical professor of law and associate dean for diversity and inclusion at the University of Toledo College of Law. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you and to also welcome my friend and former colleague at UT Law, Professor David Harris. I have no doubt that you'll enjoy his presentation and find it inspiring and thought-provoking. Before I move on and introduce Professor Harris, we'd like to recognize that today is the 19th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks on our country. So in honor of all the victims of the 9/11 attacks, please let's observe just a moment of silence. Thank you. Now let me introduce our speaker today. David A. Harris is the Sally Ann Semenko Chair and Professor of Law at the University of Pittsburgh's Law School, where he teaches criminal law, criminal procedure, evidence, and other courses. Professor Harris devotes his research and writing to the study of police conduct, search and seizure law, and the intersection of race and criminal justice. He's the leading national authority on racial profiling. His 2002 book, Profiles in Injustice, and his many scholarly articles on the topic resulted in new laws and regulations in hundreds of American police departments. His latest book, A City Divided, Race, Fear, and the Law in Police Confrontations, published this year by Anthem Press, uses a case of police violence against a young man in Pittsburgh to ask why these incidents keep happening and what we can do to stop this. Professor Harris is also the creator and host of the Criminal Injustice podcast, devoted since 2016 to interviews with justice system actors on the most difficult problems in the criminal system. In Pittsburgh and in other communities around the country, he's applied his work to creating better relationships between police and the communities they serve to bring about both respectful, just policing and public safety. This work resulted in David receiving the Jefferson Award for Public Service in 2015. David, it's great to have you with us today, and thank you for being here.
It's a great pleasure to be with you. I am of Toledo, as many of you know. I spent some very good years there, and it's a real privilege to have the opportunity to talk to you today about the difficulties that we all know about with police-civilian confrontations. There's almost nothing that we could talk about together that would be more current and more important. This, of course, goes beyond simply the importance to the folks most directly affected, people of color. It goes to everyone concerned with fairness, justice, and building a society that works for everyone. We all know that police confrontations with civilians and citizens is not the only problem we have, far from it. But it is what I can tell you about today. So I'm going to spend my few minutes with you talking about what the scope of the problem really is, why we have it, and what we can do about it. And a lot of my remarks today are based upon the research that I did for my book, A City Divided, which was published in January by Anthem Press. So let's talk about the scope of the problem, fatal police shootings. What do we know about this? Well, frightfully little. And you may be really surprised by that because you're hearing a lot about this, but it's true. The data that we have about shootings of civilians, lay people by police, does not come from the United States government. It does not come from the U.S. Department of Justice, where you would expect to get it in an authoritative form. Rather, we get our information now from two media sources, the Washington Post and the Guardian, which have kept track of this activity since 2015, and that was directly in the wake of and because of the events in Ferguson, Missouri, in which Michael Brown died, the events in New York City, Staten Island, where Eric Garner died, and others did. The Washington Post and the Guardian have pretty good data. It comes from news reports, social media postings, and police reports. But why aren't we getting this from our government? Why aren't we getting it from law enforcement? Well, there are rules and laws about this, but actually law enforcement's own reports to the FBI underreport fatal shootings by law enforcement by more than half. And this is because the federal government can't really make local police departments report this data or report it in a standardized way that allows apples to apples comparison. This is what former Attorney General Eric Holder called a complete disgrace as far as our ability to track such important activity as a country. And I have to say, I agree with him. But the Washington Post and Guardian information is pretty solid. And now we have 4 years in a row running and half of 2020. And the data is pretty good. So let's use that as our source. What is the scope of the problem? Well, here's a graph that plots that Washington Post data over several years. And what you see here, their feature on this is called Fatal Force. You can look it up today and get the up-to-the-day numbers on this. This goes back to mid-June, and you see here from 2015 to the present, we're on roughly the same trajectory we have been on each year. There are a little more or a little less than 1,000 fatal police shootings year in and year out in the United States. And so we have an idea of the scope of this particular problem. But this doesn't tell us enough because as we know now, given the questions that everybody's been asking over the last few months, the question is not just how many, but how are those distributed? In what circumstances do they occur? And what can we know from that? And here's a little more information that I think will fill out those blank spots. If you look at the data, the scope of the problem and who is subject to these shootings, you only get the answers that really count, I would contend, when you break them down by who encounters this behavior. All right, from police. For Black Americans, there are 31 fatal shootings per million persons. For Hispanic Americans, it's 23 per million persons. For white Americans, it is 13 per million persons. Okay, this is actually the more informative way to look at it, not just raw numbers. So what you can see here is that Black people are more than twice as likely to be fatally shot by a police officer than a white person is. Right? It's incontrovertible. It's basically the same year in and year out. And that is what we should notice beyond simply the numbers here. And an Hispanic person, almost twice as likely as a white person. These are called odds ratios, right? What are the odds of a Black person having this happen to them versus the odds of a white person having this happen to them? This, I think, begins to get at what the real problem is, or what we are concerned about now. A little more then. What do we know? All right. I think it's important to say, though these are much more visible events than they used to be, because of the presence of cell phone video and to a much lesser extent body camera video, we see them much more, but they are not, this problem is not getting worse. All right. Not from anything we can see, even though it may feel worse, especially when we look at something like the horrible video of the murder of George Floyd or so many others that have occurred recently. There's a reason that that feels worse. We're being traumatized each time we watch something like that. And when I say we, it occurs to a greater degree for people of color as they watch somebody who looks just like them have it happen to them when they've heard these stories for their entire lives. We'll come back to that point a little later. But the scope of it does not seem to be getting worse in any way that we can count empirically. By the same token, it's also not getting better. It's not changing for the better. We don't see that 1,000 number inching downward, in other words. It's a little above, it's a little below 1,000 year in and year out, to the extent we can tell, because our government doesn't do anything to tell us this, or at least doesn't do enough. From the Washington Post and Guardian data, that is what we see. And what the other solid thing we know is that blacks die at twice the rate of whites. Right? And that should really capture our attention. We should be asking why, and that is the purpose of a lot of what I'll have to say to you today. Why do these things keep happening with black people much more often than they would with white people? All right. But before we go there, I really want to call attention to something that the numbers we do have, I give all the credit to the Washington Post and the Guardian for putting this together. The numbers we have, surely they understate the problem, the overall problem of the use of force by police, because just fatal shootings by police is not by any means the whole picture on the use of force. No way. Actually, these numbers that we have, the 1,000 per year, do not capture uses of deadly force that don't involve firearms, right? So actually, George Floyd will not show up in the Washington Post numbers. He wasn't shot. Right? And then there's this. They don't cover deadly force from firearms or other sources that don't result in death. So if a police officer shoots and misses, which I am told by police officers is more common than actually hitting a person, or if a police officer shoots and wounds, injures, but doesn't kill, that doesn't show up either. We're not getting the full picture there either. And both of these things, it should be obvious, they involve the use of the most extreme kinds of state power against individual Americans. And we have no idea overall how common they are, who they are most often applied to, except on sort of closely studied city by city basis. And of course, we know very little about non-deadly or less lethal force, things like neck holds, right? Neck pressure, because things like that are not considered everywhere to be deadly force, despite George Floyd's death. They're considered less lethal, as in they can kill, but usually don't. All right. Sometimes we do have a picture of the use of force overall on a city by city basis, and there's no better place to go for this than sort of the epicenter where this all started just a few months ago, and that would be Minneapolis. So looking deeper into use of force overall, what do we see? Look at this. Okay. What we see is that race is a clear determinant of the use of police force. All right. The Minneapolis police, over a period going back more than 10 years, used force against black people at 7 times the rate that they used it on white people. And this is all types of uses of force. This next graph breaks it down by type, right? Pointing a gun, using a chemical spray, neck restraints, an improvised weapon, a police canine. You go to any category of use of force, and blacks are over half of all the people who experience police use of force in that period in Minneapolis. And in some cases, such as gunpoint display, they are 2/3, roughly, All right. So this is a particular problem that is infected with race. Now, I know that there are a couple of usual objections to what I've just put out for you, and I want to deal with them up front and very candidly. You probably know who this guy is. He's our Attorney General, right? This is Attorney General William Barr gave an extensive interview to National Public Radio back at the end of June. I heard it. I listened to it again. I wanted to be careful about what he said. And there are a couple of things in there that I think I think they're fairly put into the category of the usual kinds of objections. And I want to deal with those, like I said, right at the top. First, he said, you're actually looking at a very small number of Black people killed by police. And he pulled the numbers out. He had them at hand as he talked to the journalist. He said it's only, 30 some in this year, and it's only X in this other year. Those are actually quite small numbers given how many police encounters per year. Yes. True, they are small numbers, but you're missing the point if this is what you think. The point is, as I was showing before, not how many in a given year, but what are the odds that a Black person will experience this versus that a white person will. It's, as I said before, the odds ratio, or measuring it on a per population basis, per million Black people, per million white people. How likely is this? That's what we should really be interested in, because that really tells the tale. Right? It's not just how often it happens, it's how much more likely it is to happen to one group as opposed to another when they are conceivably, for all we know, behaving in exactly the same sorts of ways that gets them shot and killed. Next most common objection is this. Many more Black people are killed by other Black people than are killed by police officers. Why don't you talk about that? Now, I know many people have heard that objection, and many people say this, right? And it is true that Black people are killed by Black people. There's no question about that. That's a serious problem, and it's something we have to think about. We could have another discussion, a different talk about that if we wanted to. I'd be glad to come back. But this is not actually the same problem. It's a terrible problem, but it's not the same problem at all. It's actually true of white people too, right? But it's used here to say to Black people, why don't you get your own house in order before you start pointing your finger at the police? My objection to this is more fundamental, I think, even than the first, and that is that a killing by a police officer is just different than a killing by some random criminal or murderer. It's a killing by the state. All right, state power is being used to kill a person who is comes within the protections of the Fourth Amendment. The people shall be protected from unreasonable searches and seizures, and of course, using force in any form is a seizure, and using deadly force is the most seizing you can do as a government agent called a police officer. When somebody dies at the hands of police, it is simply in a different category. That is the state's own authority and agent, literally wearing the uniform, carrying the badge and the weapons of the state. And that is why that person is allowed to kill in certain circumstances. I'm not naive. I do understand that many situations progress to a point in the things that police officers do that they use deadly force. They have to protect other people or to protect themselves, and they have a legal right to do so in the right situations. But it's different than simple crime. And anybody who makes that argument is simply either ignoring the fact that state violence, state sanctioned violence is different, or they're trying to get you to not notice what the real issue is. So that's the scope of the problem as I see it. Where does this come from? What's the source of this? And in my research and my work and my writing of A City Divided, I point myself at two twin problems, and those are the problems of race and fear. These two things go together. They are the twin poisons that account for the greater amount of state violence and police shootings and killings and injuries of Black people than white people ever would experience. And they're the reasons we keep seeing these things, race and fear. It's no surprise, I think, to most people in America today that the dominant stereotypes of Black people, particularly Black men, are that they are criminal, they are violent, they are dangerous. These dominant stereotypes have been around for a long time and have been measured and quantified and reckoned with in all of the psychology and sociology literature that's out there since after the Second World War. But this is actually a new era in terms of research on race. I'd say the last 20 years. And that is being led, these efforts are being led by social psychologists who are doing incredible cutting edge work with race, in which they're able to probe far beneath the surface of simple stereotyping to figure out what's really going on. Let me show you just a couple of things, a couple of the studies that have established the fact that race is one of the poisons here that we must reckon with. This study was called Seeing Black, Race, Crime, and Visual Processing. The lead investigator here is Jennifer Eberhardt, Stanford professor, MacArthur winner, author of a great new book. Philip Atiba Goff, who was her student and protege, now is off on his own producing some of the most cutting edge work that there is, also head of the Center for Policing Equity and soon to be a professor at Yale. These researchers and their colleagues did this landmark study. It goes back to 2004, where they looked at how the brain and the visual system works when influenced by race. Okay, they used an effect called priming on their experimental subjects. You probably know what this is if you took Psych 101, if it wasn't too long ago. They show a very brief image of a face or an object or something like that to prime the experimental subject. And then they show other images and they look at the differences depending on the priming images. What they have found has actually been pretty startling. When they show images, very quickly that is, of Black people's faces, they find that the visual systems, the eyes, the brains of their experimental subjects, and this is whether the subjects are white, Black, or something else, become much, much keener, better, and faster at picking out weapons in degraded images. They show an image that's kind of like this snow on the old TVs at your grandparents' house, like that. And slowly, image after image after image, something in the background becomes much, much easier to see. In image number 1, you really can't see anything except the snow. In image number 40, you see it's clearly the outline of a weapon. When they prime the subjects with the face of a Black person as opposed to a white person, the people with the Black person's face as a prime pick out that image of a gun much earlier in the series of 40 slides of degraded images than people shown faces of white people. They pick it out more accurately and faster. They also use the priming effect to then show the experimental subjects a photograph of a crowd of people standing around. And when they show a Black face as opposed to a white face, or when they show an image of a crime-related object, right, like a gun, a knife, a club, something like that, as opposed to just some other neutral object, the eyes of the experimental subject go directly to where in the picture there's a Black person. Right? So according to the researchers, Blackness serves as a, quote, visual tuning device, heavily influenced by thoughts of objects prompting crime. Right? Here's another, and the lead scientist here was Philip Atiba Goff. The essence of innocence, consequences of dehumanizing Black children. What Goff and his team found was that people viewing images of Black children as opposed to images of white children consistently overestimated their age, their size, their maturity, their muscularity, and the nature of were they threatening or not, right? As opposed to images of white children. You may recognize the person in this next image here. This is Tamir Rice. He was killed by Cleveland police. He's 12 years old. He was playing with a toy gun in a park when somebody called the police and said, there's somebody over there, it looks like they have a gun in that park. It's probably a toy. That last piece of information apparently did not make it from the dispatcher to the police unit, which pulled up to 12-year-old Tamir and within 2 seconds shot him dead. Right? For our purposes here today, here is the most interesting part of the discussion. It's in the police reports and the statements even of prosecutors that came later after this tragedy. Here were the words of Officer Lohman, who killed Tamir. Quote, he appeared to be over 18 years old and 185 pounds. Both of these overestimates by about 50%. And even months later, the prosecutors were making very similar arguments. Tamir was big for his age, men's XL jacket, size 36 pants, could have easily passed for someone much older, really falling right in line with the police report. So Blackness emphasizes in the minds of Americans threat and fear, up, down, and sideways. So if race is one of the biggest influences, what about fear? I want to talk about fear from two different points of view, from both the point of view of people of color, which I'm sure you might have expected me to talk about, but also from the point of view of police. Right? Now, some might think, why from the point of view of police? Aren't police courageous and brave and so forth? Undoubtedly, I want to say clearly, undoubtedly, as former President Obama said so memorably, these are the people who run toward the danger when the rest of us run in the other direction. I am not doubting the physical courage and bravery of police for 1 second. But I do want to say that there are distinct aspects of police training and culture that amp up the existing fear that any human being would have in a dangerous situation. They don't amp it down, they amp it up. Okay, let me give you a couple of examples, just maybe one today, and we'll talk about more in Q&A if you want. This is the cover of a book. It's obviously called On Combat. You maybe can't read the tiny print at the bottom. The Psychology and Physiology of Deadly Conflict in War and Peace. Right? It's written by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. And he makes a living as a speaker at private police trainings all over the country. And this is an industry. There are a lot of these trainings going on. You can look this guy up on YouTube. You can see him talking about this stuff. And you can, of course, read his book, as I did. And what you'll find is the idea that the police officer must be a warrior. And this has kind of permeated police training and culture everywhere. It may not be labeled that way in individual police academies, but it's clearly labeled that way in these private after graduation from the academy trainings. And the idea is all over law enforcement today. What's the idea of being a warrior? You're out there, it's a war, there's deadly violence everywhere. The only thing protecting the sheep, and that's you and I for the most part, who just want to be left alone to eat the grass. The only thing protecting the sheep are the sheepdogs, and those are the police, because the deadly bloodthirsty wolves are everywhere. They may strike at a moment's notice. And the sheepdogs, this is Lieutenant Grossman's favorite metaphor other than just warrior itself. The sheepdogs are the ones keeping everyone safe. You will find police officers trained pretty much everywhere to assume that every encounter with a civilian, not just some, not just a few, not just a small number, which is what the data actually tell you, but every possible encounter with a civilian, traffic stops, encounters on the street, they are all to be treated as potential deadly encounters until proven otherwise. You are to assume that every encounter with a civilian is potentially deadly. That is the warrior mindset. That is how the fear is amped up. Then they're shown videos over and over, different videos of usually dash cam videos of officers being shot and assaulted and knifed and murdered right in front of you. And this is sometimes in the service of don't make these tactical mistakes, but most often it's look what's out there waiting for you, police recruits. You can find these things online too. There's a sort of library, a canon of these videos. The warrior mindset I found described in this recent article and in this recent interview that I heard. That's exactly what police training does, said this gentleman who is a police officer and ex-CIA. Every situation is not just can be dangerous, but it will be dangerous because you're in a war on crime, and anybody can kill you. Right? He went on to say, in an article he wrote on the same theme, the well-documented militarization of American police departments has inevitably produced officers who see themselves in their roles as warriors or punishers or sheepdogs. There it is. What our society finds so distressing in police interactions, disrespect, anger, frustration, and violence, is not a result of flawed training. It's a result of training for war. So it's working the way it's supposed to. Right? So if that's fear on the police side, here it is on the side of people of color. Maybe all civilians, but people of color especially. It is generational. They have heard these stories or had these experiences themselves. They've heard them from grandparents, uncles, aunts, parents, brothers, sisters, or they have been in these situations themselves where they are subject to abusive treatment, disrespectful treatment, and sometimes put in physical danger in their encounters with police. I never saw this put better than by Nicole Hannah-Jones, excuse me. She is the person behind the 1619 Project, amongst other things. And I read this essay, which was separate from 1619, and it made such an impression on me, I haven't forgotten it. And here's one line from it as she addresses white readers on why African Americans really don't expect any fair treatment from police or the justice system. She said, quote, "It's possible this will come as a surprise to you, but to a very real extent, you have grown up in a different country than I have. A different country." And that is no exaggeration. It's a different reality for Black people and brown people in this country vis-a-vis policing. A different reality. I've been working in this area and talking with and interviewing people of color since I was a long time back when I was in Toledo. First interview I did was in a coffee shop, I think next to a bowling alley off of Bancroft, right? You know which that one is? And I remember it. And this is the sentiment. This is the reality of their lives, right? You may know about this, you may not, but when Black parents, when their children reach driving age, they have the talk with those kids. Sometimes it's just earlier because reality intrudes, right? And this is the way that Black parents have handled this for a long time before a kid goes out to drive, because it's not a matter of if the police will stop them, but when. And they know that this is not a joke. It is a potentially deadly encounter, potentially deadly. And so they talk to their children about how to survive it. Survival is the thing. Don't argue, keep your hands visible, make no motions to get anything without saying something to the officer. The most important thing is that you get home safe. If you want to argue, tell me about it. We'll make a complaint. Do not argue there. Just get home. You want to have your heart broken? This little video here, I'm not going to play it, but this video is about 4 minutes long. It's called Dear Child. You can look it up and watch it. So, race and fear. These are the keys to why this keeps happening. So is there anything that can be done? I would say if I thought it was hopeless, I should just pack up and go away. And I can't do this work without being a little hopeful, at least. And I know there are lots of people these days who just say, abolish the police, get rid of them. I sometimes say, defund them, right? I'm going to talk about that very thing in a minute. But, you know, I have no trouble understanding that sentiment, okay? When after years and years of trying to reform in policing, George Floyd dies the way he does, with a man standing on his neck in a police uniform, seeming to have no more concern than if he were just waiting for his sandwich at Subway. Right? But I do think there are things that we can do, and I'll offer those to you now. The first thing would be to move from warrior type policing to guardian policing. There's a big difference. You want to know more about guardian policing, you should look at this. And I apologize for the coloring here. It's kind of unfortunate, but that is the actual color of the cover of the final report of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. That is, of course, the last president. It was published in 2015. And recommendation number 1 is move from warrior to guardian. Unfortunately, only a few departments have really done that, but some have gone, gone whole hog, gone right in there, and it's paying off. What does that mean? Well, I already talked about warrior policing and what that means. Guardian policing is simply the idea that goes back to the origins of policing, with Sir Robert Peel in the UK as Prime Minister setting up the very first organized police force and saying things like his 9 principles, which is the people are the police are the people. The consent of the people is what police depend upon to actually do their jobs, and they're there to keep order and peace. They're not out there to, quote, get the bad guys. It's not a war. When there's a war, casualties happen, and that's acceptable. When there's a war, collateral damage occurs, and some level of that is acceptable. We can't accept that. Here's a little more from somebody who knows. This person wrote a great piece in the Wall Street Journal back in July. What characterizes warrior policing? Those officers choose their own side. It's us versus them. Guardian officers choose the law. Warriors dehumanize the enemy. That's how they can use violence. And Grossman's idea is, to be a warrior, you have to be ready to use righteous violence at a moment's notice. You got to be trained and ready to do that, because the wolf is everywhere. Guardians don't dehumanize others. They see people as individuals. Warriors survive by reacting. Guardians slow it down. They think, they doubt their first impressions, all when it's safe to do so. So it's a much different mindset. What else? We have to have transparency and accountability. Now, these sound like, high-flown principles or something. They are not. They are what law enforcement pretty much everywhere has lacked, as long as I've been in the field and longer than that, right? There's very little transparency about police misconduct and police discipline. There's little accountability in most police departments for misconduct. This has to change, and it is starting to. The law is changing around it. Right? The pictures that you see up there from the Chicago Police Department and that gentleman, I picked this out deliberately. The Chicago Police Department has had a troubled history. I think probably most of you know that in at least a sort of general way. But they were never transparent and had just some of the worst misconduct forever. Laquan McDonald is just one small piece of that picture. And little accountability because nobody knew and nobody could tell. And so officers basically circled the wagons. They did things like you saw in the Laquan McDonald case, like lie for each other, basically, right? Cover it up. It was just business as usual. The man on the right side of the screen, his name is Jamie Calvin. He's a journalist and a longtime human rights activist. And after first a years-long battle in federal court that he lost, and then a years-long battle in state court that he won, under Illinois law now, police misconduct records, police disciplinary records are public records. Public records. And that is making a difference. His organization, which is called the Invisible Institute, a little satire there, I guess, has a database that features all these records going back years. And the public now knows who does what and what happens. Just in June, New York State changed its longstanding law that protected police disciplinary records and kept them secret. And last year, California passed a law that did the same thing. Now, this ain't going to be easy. I don't want anybody to get that idea. Even in these states like New York and California that have changed their law, the police unions and their allies have pushed back against it hard, have gone to court, but it's coming. And you should make it come in your state too. There's simply no reason that this should continue. Use of force law has to change. Use of force law must change. California did it in this bill in 2019, AB 392. You see Governor Newsom signing it there, but it's not the only state that's done this. District of Columbia has just done it for itself because it has its own lawmaking powers. The Congress has use of force law changes in the Justice and Policing Act of 2020, which has passed the House, not the Senate. And it's done many other things in that bill too. But like I said, this is not the only places it's happening. Right? There's a bill in my state that has been introduced by a representative from my county in the wake of a terrible police shooting we had in 2018. And this is going to happen. And by the way, police departments themselves and city councils themselves can do this. They don't even have to wait for changes in the state law. And it doesn't matter that the U.S. Constitution, Fourth Amendment, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, has set the use of force standard in the Graham versus Connor case, which all you lawyers probably know, and law students probably know that too. The reasonable objective officer. That's the minimum standard. The minimum standard. A city, a police department, a state can give its citizens more protection from the use of force by police. They simply have to have the political will to do it. Decriminalize. And I don't just mean that, right? Sure, cannabis, decriminalize. We don't need that to be a criminal offense anymore. But lots of things don't need to be criminal offenses and result in catastrophes like what you see there. Really? We need police enforcing the law against loose, untaxed cigarettes. Then Eric Garner ends up in a chokehold and dies. And that's not all, right? What other things could be not police business that typically are? How about traffic offenses? Okay, I want police to enforce laws against DWI and reckless driving, but equipment violations? 5 miles over the speed limit? And we can do a lot of that with technology now, right? We don't need a police encounter that may turn dangerous. Sleeping in public areas, the criminalization of homelessness, we don't need police doing that. And here's a secret, they don't want to do it either. Drug offenses tied to addiction. Do we really need possession of substances for a person's own use? Does that have to be a criminal offense? Shouldn't we be sending out social workers and medical workers for overdoses and addiction? Okay, let's take on this idea of defunding or abolishing the police, because this gets a lot of play now. This is an idea that 1 year ago would be seen only in academic circles and only some of those, and on the far left of the political spectrum. Now you see that picture up there on the right. That's 9 members of the Minneapolis City Council saying we're going to vote as a majority to abolish the Minneapolis Police Department, and they did. Now they've been held up by some charter issues, right? The Charter Commission, whatever the body is, refused to go along. But there are plenty of people who want to defund, basically abolish their own police forces. What about this? Let's probe a little more deeply. Is this really abolition, or are we talking about a big change in priorities? I talk to a lot of people about this. I'm a member of our mayor's commission to reform the police here in Pittsburgh. We've heard from a lot of people who have come basically as speakers and witnesses and so forth. And I've talked to my fellow task force members about it. You get a different answer on this from almost everybody. So there isn't one definition here. And I'd say from most people, even people who are strong advocates and are out marching in the street, what they want is a change in priorities. Sometimes they want changes in funding with that, but they don't actually always want to abolish the police, really. And when I go into community meetings, which I've been doing for years and years and years, I typically don't hear, I want no police in my community. What I hear about is usually 2 things. I don't want the police doing what they're doing to us, but I want more police. I just want a kind of policing that I can trust and work with. And I want the level of police services I would get in a more prosperous part of my town, in a whiter part of my town, right? So it's usually not abolish. Can I imagine that some people would want no police at all? Sure, I can. I have heard enough stories of people whose car gets stolen and they call the police and they end up in handcuffs. Or they call because there's a burglary and their kids end up on the floor with guns pointing at them. That kind of thing. I can imagine not wanting any more police after encounters like that, but more often is they want a different experience with police, right? Because their experience has been different. They grew up in a different country and reality. So what should we be thinking about? Reimagining the police and policing, unbundling that bundle of services that we have police typically delivering, and ask, where do we want people with guns and handcuffs to actually show up? Right? What do we want them actually doing? We want them to respond to serious crime, which, by the way, is a small percentage of what most police in most police departments are doing. But for non-criminal responses like noise complaints or barking dogs, people in mental health crises, homelessness, drug addiction, we don't need the handcuffs usually, right? We could have other service providers. So you ask, for which of these do we actually need the police? And then that gives us a chance to minimize police encounters. And then we can transfer resources with responsibility to other actors and agencies. So I think there are ways to tackle these sorts of things. I have enjoyed very much having the opportunity to speak to Toledo, to my friends at the College of Law. And this has been a great opportunity for me. I hope that when times change and we can all be in each other's physical presence, I'll have a chance to do it again. But for now, I just want to say thank you very much to the College of Law, to Rob Salem, to Heather Carnes, to everybody who made this possible. And I hope you'll have some questions for me. Have empathy for each other. This is the root of all things human.
David, it's been our pleasure hearing from you this morning. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise on this subject. And we hope as well that we'll see you in person sooner than later, hopefully sometime next year.
Amen to that.
At this point, I've been getting several questions So let me do my best to get to as many of these as possible. David, the first one is, do we have any data or do we know how deadly police shootings track across socioeconomic status, not just race?
Great question. And I'd have to say, sadly, no. That is just at the very beginning stages. And you could see in the first few slides why that is. We've had so little cooperation from police departments across the country, just getting the very basic data that the default sources are now these media organizations. Some of that data is beginning to be studied and broken down. I got a media inquiry just the other day about sort of probing into some of these preliminary questions about not only who it's happening to, but tell us about those people. But right now, we just don't know. We just don't know. One would assume, and this is clearly just a fact-free assumption, I want to be clear about that, that you'd see the same kinds of patterns we see with other police actions, but there's just no way to know at this point. I wish I did.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, what as a citizen can I do to work toward more humane policing?
I think what we have to do as citizens is we have to understand that we actually have the power to determine what kind of policing we will have. We have simply not realized it or exercised it. What I mean by that is probably best captured in what I was saying about changing use of force law. Right? In the past several months, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, any number of cities have made changes in how policing works by passing local law. All right, it's not as widespread, I think, as many people had hoped, and certainly on the state level, it's been kind of disappointing, given the initial enthusiasm and push for important state law changes. And usually in states, state law has something to, certainly true in my state of Pennsylvania, state law has a lot to do with the control of the disciplinary process being often in the hands to some degree or another of unions and arbitrators. But what we have to do to get improved policing is to understand we actually should be having a say. We should not simply leave these questions to the city council and the police chief and say, well, they must be doing okay, unless we actually think they are. We must insist on the policing we want. All right. So that means political action. And that means both demonstrations and protests at times, but it's also you want to have people on your political bodies like your city council and in your state legislature feel pressure to fix these things because they can do it. There is nothing in the Constitution that says that the objectively reasonable officer standard is the only standard that will work for Fourth Amendment seizure purposes and use of force. It's just that we've always treated it that way. And so we need to get in the game and insist that power that is ours be used in a way that we want it to be. And that has a fundamentally political way of acting attached to it. You must do that. You simply must. The thing is, though, if you do, you really can't influence things. I mean, I'll give you one quick example. Apart from everything with George Floyd, one of the members of the city council here in Pittsburgh introduced a bill a couple of weeks ago that would ban the use of facial recognition technology and algorithms for predictive policing within the Pittsburgh Police Department. Now, some of you probably know what those things are. I won't take extra time to explain them, but the fact that that bill was introduced was itself a kind of a change. It's saying, no, we want to get ahead of this. There's a debate going on in Baltimore right now about should Baltimore employ a private firm to put giant photograph-taking drones in the sky over Baltimore at all times for public safety purposes, a giant aerial surveillance system. And they're having a debate. We must debate this stuff. We can't leave it for officials and courts.
Thank you. We hear a lot about police unions and how unions may, in some cases, police chiefs are speaking out against police unions. Can you comment a little bit about how unions interact with this topic?
Yes. Oh, yes. This is so important. I'm glad somebody asked. Unions for police are among the few fast-growing and strong unions out there. There are other public employee unions that are also have been growing over the last few years, but nothing like police unions. Police unions had almost died out by the 1960s. But they had a revival when citizens started to insist on some civilian oversight of policing, and that became their signature issue. What's happened in the decades since is that through work in state legislatures and in negotiations with city governments, instead of paying police, better wages and better benefits, instead traded off pieces of the disciplinary process. It gave unions much more power in the disciplinary process. And that was done at the level of state law, too. So to the point where in Pennsylvania, chiefs have very limited powers to fully and finally fire somebody. You go to these professional conferences like I do for police, like the blah, blah Association of Chiefs of Police, and you wait till, the seminars are all done, and then you find all of them in the bar. And you come up and you listen to the conversations, and so many of them are like, I fired this guy and now I got him back and he was doing X. And the next person says, oh yeah, well, I fired a guy for doing Y and I got him back. And this is all due to an arbitration process that frankly does not always have the interests of the public at stake, and the public should be at that table. So what has to happen is often state law, but certainly local collective bargaining agreements must be changed in order to give the chief full disciplinary control of the department. Not all chiefs will use it or use it wisely. We know that. We can deal with that in a different way. But right now, the system is way out of balance, and it is often used to protect not just people on the police side who are maybe being treated unfairly in some way, but some of the worst keep their jobs. Then the rest of the department sees that, and the message is unmistakable. So this is a real problem that needs to be addressed. And again, it takes political will.
Great, thank you. One of our attendees wants to know how you would suggest that police handle riots and looting.
I'm not a person who believes that robust protest has to include riots and looting. I'd be very careful myself with the distinction between protests and riots. I think you can have a very robust protest, even a protest that breaks some laws by, blocking a street or something, that is not a riot. All right. A riot means that you have damage to property and persons occurring. All right. Looting means something else. And I'd be careful with that term too. I know a lot of the people listening and watching have probably seen the contrasting news reports that have been seen after natural disasters. And the one that always stands out to me is Hurricane Katrina. Because in New Orleans, in the wake of Katrina, there are lots of media reports showing people breaking into stores. And when the store was being broken into by a crowd of black people, it was looting. When the same kind of store was being broken into by white people, it was people getting important medical and food supplies. I'm not joking. You can go and look yourselves, all right? So I would be careful with the terminology and how we think about that. With all that said, I am not a believer in protest having to include violence, or in violence as an acceptable voice for the downtrodden. I don't believe that necessarily has to be, and I don't support any part of a protest that ends up in breaking into stores, stealing things, or hurting people. It would be easy for you to say back to me, perhaps, well, that's because you're a privileged older white man. I accept that. I accept that. But I can't accept the fact that we would destroy a store or a restaurant where a lot of people have jobs, and maybe that's the only job they can get. What about those people? Or people who put their heart and soul into a business and find it destroyed? Is it okay if they're large chain stores? No, it's not okay. It's not okay. So, in terms of meeting protest, I think we're at a difficult moment that we can handle, right? It doesn't require the use of force or gas or things like that, except in the most extreme situations. So I would just make the distinction, I think, between lawful, robust protest, even constant, inconvenient protest, and what the questionnaires called rioting and looting. That has to be met with appropriate law enforcement activity.
David, are there any communities in the country that you can point to that are really great models of policing? Communities that have been doing it well or are starting to do it better?
Yes, there certainly are. Um, I'll give you just a couple of examples. I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear me say the LAPD, the Los Angeles Police Department, because they had the worst reputation of any big city police department, and especially on issues of race and criminal justice for so long. Think of the Rodney King riots, think of all of that, the Rampart scandal. I mean, you just name it. But for some years now, with a brand new chief, with federal intervention, and now there are two chiefs past that first one. They are transformed. They are not perfect. They're not perfect, but they simply said, okay, community, what is it you want? Okay, lawyers who keep suing us, tell us what we're doing wrong. I mean, literally, they did that. Um, and the department is transformed. It is a much better, still imperfect, but much better institution than it was. The other one I would point you to look at is Camden, New Jersey. Camden, New Jersey had come to kind of a point, not quite 10 years ago, more like 8 years ago, in which um, things had gotten to just an awful point. Murders were going up. Crime was going up. People just hated their police department. They were abusive. They were awful. And on top of it all, the budget situation in Camden, which is a poor city with a lot of deindustrialization, was getting worse. Police budgets were being cut. Things just didn't seem to be able to get any worse. And they got so bad that you had this constellation of factors. You had Republican Governor Chris Christie. You had a very powerful state level Democrat whose name I can't remember. And you had the city leadership in Camden just saying, you know what, we can't do any worse. Let's close it. They abolished their police department. Now, not without a plan. They went back and they reconstituted it as a county department. They basically blew it up and started over. In doing that, they ended up getting rid of the union that had been part of the first police department. Now, I don't want to give anybody the impression I'm against unions. I think unions are a good influence, and they have built the middle class in the United States. And I'm not running for anything, okay? But this union, as with so many others, police unions in the country, had just made it its practice to stand its ground, keep its own perks, and protect its worst. This allowed that union to be put out of business in Camden. Now you have a completely different situation. It is totally oriented around community policing. It's not perfect. I want to say that again, but it's much better. Crime has gone down, homicides have gone down, relationships with the police are considerably improved. And when things started to happen after the George Floyd murder, as they did in so many other cities, the demonstrations that took place there, the police were in those demonstrations, marching. The chief was there, marching. I don't think everybody loved that, honestly. It may have felt a bit co-opted, but the police said, no, we're with the community. We want better. We want to improve. And so those are two examples that I think really do stand out, but there are others too.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one more question. How can I, as a white person, become more sensitized to the country that Black people live in? Are there particular resources that you would recommend?
Boy, that's an important question and a very broad one. One of the other things that I do is I do implicit bias training, and this is a lot of what we talk about in that training. The things that I would recommend, the interventions for everybody's implicit bias, always include increasing your intergroup contact. All right. So most Americans don't live near or work with people who are different than they are. See if you can change that. Right. Because the more people that you know and interact with on a regular basis who are not like you, that will open your mind to the fact that they are individuals, and you will begin to hear what their lives are like. It will just happen. Number two, I'd read some things. All right. I don't have any particular examples, but among the things would be Abraham Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. That's a place you could go. A lot of people have picked up the book whose title includes the words white fragility. I don't know what I think about that. A lot of people like that approach. I'm not so sure if that's the best way to go. But begin to understand that you carry these biases around too, that your skin color gives you privileges that you don't, your fellow citizens who are dark-skinned do not have. Think about those things as you watch society, listen to people talk. Be conscious of it, because the more you can be conscious of it, the more you can slow down your decision making and think, the more your own beliefs in equality and fairness can control the things you do, right? We're all acting all the time with implicit bias influencing our behavior, and if we can walk away from that, it's just better.
Thank you. David, do you have time for one more question?
I certainly do.
Okay, it's 1 o'clock. There are some questions coming in about this idea that we sometimes hear from the public, that if people just don't resist arrest, they won't get into trouble. Can you please comment on that?
Sure, and I talk about that some in my book. The book is centered around a single incident in Pittsburgh that happened 10 years ago. 3 Pittsburgh police officers and 1 young African-American young man, 18 years old, a high school senior. The incident has some disputed aspects to it, but one of the aspects that is not disputed is that the young man began to run. And what a lot of people said was, well, if he had just stayed there and answered their questions, everything would have been fine. This is all his fault. This is all his fault. And I think that's kind of what people are wondering. If people didn't resist, if people didn't run and so forth, wouldn't these things not happen? Well, let me just say a couple of things about that. Remember that for your Black and brown brothers and sisters, the world isn't the same as it is for you. And I'm addressing people who look like me. It's not the same. They haven't had the same experiences. They've had much different experiences with police. And those experiences and the ones they've heard about for their entire lives from others tell them this: behaving properly, not resisting and not running, is no guarantee that you are going to be treated properly. It breaks my heart to say that, because I want to believe in the goodness of all things and people. But it's just not reality. It's not reality that if you don't resist and you don't run and you just don't do anything, you'll be safe. That may be true for me. I think it probably is. It's not true for African Americans in America. It's not true for Latinos in America. Maybe in most cases it is, but it's not universally true. They can't count on that. So when that young man that I wrote the book about, even if we take the police story at face value, and not everybody does, but even if we take it at face value that they were just asking him questions, is he really wrong to think that this could go sideways in a hurry? That he could get hurt here? That these questions sounded kind of hostile to him? And what's going to happen next? Why are they looking at him that way? Is he really wrong? Right? So I'm not, yes, great. If everybody never resisted a police command, the world would be different. But it wouldn't necessarily be good for people who don't look like me. And that's what you have to keep in mind. People who are brown and black do not live the same reality vis-a-vis police that the rest of us do. And until that changes, it's not reasonable to say, well, they should just not resist. I wish that could always be true and would always ensure everybody's safety, but that's not reality.
Thank you, David. And with that, I think we will call it a day. It's after 1 o'clock. I'm sure everybody's applauding. I wish you could hear them.
I wish I could too.
This has been incredibly informative and inspiring.
Thank you.
Me personally, and I'm sure to every attendee. It was very well attended today. And we obviously miss you in Toledo, David.
Oh, thank you, Rob. I miss all of you too. And all I want out of this is someday when we're together, we're going to be around a table at the Beirut enjoying ourselves.
Absolutely. It's a date.
Okay. Thank you all
so
out
much.
there. And thank you, Toledo. It's been great to be with you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.